Great. Well, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the City Futures Research Centre seminar series. I'm Dr. Richard Billingsley. The seminar series is hosted on the traditional lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. So I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present, especially to any First Nations people joining us today. Now, today we welcome two speakers from the UK and thank everyone who's braving these very early morning hours to join us. First, some quick housekeeping. If you're joining online, you're not a speaker, please mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the presentation. And then when we get to the Q&A, if you'd like to turn these back on, you're very welcome to. You can also put questions in the chat. That's a really good idea. Now I'm going to invite Professor Halvorsen to introduce today's speakers.
Thanks very much, Richard. Well, very pleased to welcome Alex Marsh and Ken Gibb, professors from the universities of Bristol and Glasgow, respectively, who've very doggedly got up very early from where they are in their hometowns. And they're people, just for anybody who doesn't know, Ken and Alex are both highly renowned academic housing experts on the UK and globally, in fact. And we've actually got very strong links with both of them, and we actually worked together on City Futures, Chris Martin and myself, and colleagues, only a couple of years ago on a great project. So we've done a lot. We've done a project together recently, and we've known each other a long time. So just to introduce them individually, Ken is a professor of housing economics at the University of Glasgow. He's also director of the ESRC Centre Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which is a big academic housing research collaboration. His latest publications include a handbook of housing economics, which is a heavyweight must-read, I would say, for any housing researcher. Ken also is a board member at Shelter Scotland, at a housing association, Clyde Valley, and also he's a member of the Scottish Government's Housing Investment Task Force. Alex, meanwhile, University of Bristol, is a co-investigator. He's also part of the CASH Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence that Ken leads. Alex has been involved in housing research for many decades, at least 3, in fact. And he also Alex focuses primarily on rental housing. He was a managing editor of Housing Studies for quite some time as well. So I'd like to hand over, I believe Ken is going to begin. There is a third author of the report that Alex and Ken will be talking about, and Alice may also be joining us. She may be on the call already. So welcome to Alice if she's already with us. Over to you, Ken.
Thanks very much, Alan. It's very nice to see everyone. So I believe that our colleagues in UNSW are going to push the slides forward as we go along. So thank you for doing that. So yes, I think our presentation today is about work we've recently been doing with the Church of England and the Nationwide Foundation, and essentially it's given us an opportunity to kind of cast this in a more academic way, as thinking about the goal of a well-functioning housing system conceived of in a kind of futures scenario planning way of thinking about housing strategy and policy. So Alex and I are going to split this between us. I'm going to do the front half, and Alex will do the second half. So this slide shows you the sort of main report that came out in April and was launched at the House of Lords, which is called Homes for All: A Vision for England's Housing System, and it had quite a good landing, I think, as these things go. We were really pleased in retrospect that we put a big effort into getting it out in April, just before the election was obviously announced, and there was some thinking that the election, of course, wasn't going to be till the autumn. So that turned out quite well. But there's now a huge effort underway to try and push this along. So the first thing I want to talk about is just a little bit of context. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, but just want to say a few words about the so-called housing crisis. Could you move on again on the slide? So a very overused phrase, the housing crisis, and it's been long-standing, and it's always seemed very odd to me that we seem to have a housing crisis. We're always in a housing crisis, a perma crisis, as it were. And indeed, in Scotland, we now talk about the housing emergency, which 8 local authorities in the Scottish Government have declared, and there are supposed to be action plans that follow from that. So, crisis, I don't know what comes after an emergency, a cataclysm or something like that. But we have, I mean, you can organise how you think about what housing crisis means in a number of ways. But just to give you some statistics, we know that against the kind of target that successive governments have had, which is around 300,000 units a year of housing supply, we're something like 2/3 of a million units below that target overall over the last 5 years. And also we have something like 1.2 million households in England on social housing waiting lists. Homelessness is rising. Something like 271,000 people were recorded as homeless in England in 2022, and 131,000 children were recorded in temporary accommodation in 2023. What simplest way of thinking about home ownership being beyond the reach of many people in the UK is to give you a flavour of the kind of house price to income ratios and the like. Since over the last 30 years, median incomes have risen by about 51% in England, but house prices have risen by 377%. That just gives you a sense of the exponential way in which house prices are moving out of lines with incomes. And finally, we have significant poor quality housing. 14% of all housing fails the decent home standard in England. And we think that as many as 10% of households, because of poor housing quality, are exposed to health and safety hazards and serious harm potentially. So the next thing to say is that we think that our reason, our way into this work is that while there's a lot of agreement that housing policy has been stumbling along, has lacked coherence, stability, ambition, which gets translated into action for many decades, there's a sense that there's just no ambition to really fix things on a permanent, long-term basis, and that reflects a failure to actually recognise the nature of the significance of a misfunctioning, misfiring housing system over time, and that the long-term outcomes of improvement would have a much wider impact than simply stabilising house prices or whatever your goals might actually be. And basically, for more than a decade, every study that talks about a strategy for housing says we need a national long-term strategy to be clearly articulated, to think what good would look like, and think about it over quite a long term into the future. And that's interesting because I think English housing policy continues to lack that kind of focus, priority, or indeed urgency. And that's not the case elsewhere. I mean, there are examples of attempts to have long-term policies closer to home. In Scotland, there's a 20-year policy called the Housing to 2040. I should say, apart from being very ambitious and visionary and all the rest of it, it is running into quite a lot of difficulty just now, and we can maybe talk about that if you want to. Similarly, Canada has a national housing strategy, has set up a kind of sister collaborative evidence centre on housing as well in Canada, but it operates at a federal level, and it seems to bang up against local and more regional, provincial policy. I've got a PhD student who's studying the dysfunctions of the Canadian strategy, and I know from Hal's work that there's a real concern and interest in what a well-functioning kind of housing strategy and housing system in Australia would look like as well. So there's something missing there. So to move on to the project, to move on again. So something we're clearly not doing. We're absolutely not providing another set of policy recommendations for the new government coming into power in July the 5th. There's no shortage of these. Recently, our colleagues Christine Whitehead and Tony Crook have done an interesting study for the Family Building Society, but there's also been, in the last year, 18 months, Chartered Institute Housing, National Housing Federation, Shelter, the Housing Forum, and the House Builders, among others, have produced, essentially a shopping list of policies. I mean, that's rather undermining of it. There's more to it than that in each case, but that's how they are perceived. What are the priority policy asks, as opposed to a long-term strategic issue? So our view, our aim is to kind of change this conversation and ask, what does good look like? Where are we trying to get to? How do we keep policy moving in the direction of the shared goal, as it were, for a long period of time? So we're basically saying that housing has long-term problems, and it's a long-term project to fix it. That's one of the key messages we want to ensure. So the last thing I'm going to talk about before moving on to Alex is what we call systems thinking, which infuses how we approach this work. So if we move on to the next slide, Hal. So systems thinking is somewhat implicit in the report that the Church and Nationwide Foundation produced. It's there, and those who are familiar with systems thinking will see it in it. But we're also working currently on a kind of companion, more academic piece with our colleague Alice Earley, who Al mentioned at the beginning, who may or may not be on the session just now. And we're going to basically add and augment to the fairly short, high-level report that the Church published in April to look in more detail at the evidence process that sits behind how we did this work. Also worth mentioning in the wee blue bubble that we have a kind of systems thinking research evidence overview that's coming out as well with our colleague Nicholas Harrington. But we really think it's important to think of housing in England, housing in any nation from a policy and kind of process point of view, to think systemically, to focus on long-term causes of disequilibrium or imbalance, whatever you want to think of it, rather than simply on symptoms. And that there's a real danger that focusing on symptoms can actually make things worse in the long term. That's what fixes that fail as a kind of archetype of how systems work is about. We think that the boundaries of systems are really important, and by that we mean how the housing system functionally, I suppose, relates to other systems of importance. Our colleague Jeff Mean used to always say that when you think about the drivers of house prices and housing market outcomes, you often need to look outside of the housing system to see where they are. So there's a close interconnection with economic, social security, whole range of demographic and other things which themselves have interdependencies. We're also really interested in leverage points. Where can you have the deepest, most fundamental impacts on a housing system in a kind of way which will have anticipated positive effects? They're not always in the most obvious places. And we also recognise, of course, that housing is driven by a number of key governmental departments, social security, as well as housing and the Treasury, and perhaps the Home Office as well. And we need to appreciate that they have rational silos which obviate and prevent some of the outcomes that one might wish to see. It's a very, very, very well-known point. I want to just give you a sense of, well, I was going to mention something about fixes that fail, but we can. I just want to make the point that an example, I suppose, of fixes that fail where you're addressing symptoms rather than causes is the great interest in permitted development as a way of quickly generating additional housing supply through a kind of easy planning route to convert one form of property into residential, which often is done on the cheap, as it were, and leads to poor quality housing outcomes, which might have health and well-being outcomes that are adverse. I was talking to one of Hal's colleagues beforehand about student housing, and there's a great example of that. There's a lot of permitted development happening in Scotland for student housing, converting office buildings into student accommodation, etc. And there are real long-term concerns about that. So that's a kind of example of fixes that fail. So finally, just want to say a little bit about the kind of conceptual framework that we've been using to animate the discussions we had with the experts that we talked to. So if you could move on again, one more slide, I'll just spend a minute or two on this next slide. So this is what's known as the Three Horizons framework, associated with people like Bill Sharp and Graham Lester, amongst others, but also Kate Rayworth as well. And it's a way of thinking in the present about different futures that might apply. And Horizon 1, you might call the status quo or business as usual. And the view here is that many people feel that the business as usual, particularly in the housing system, in our example, is unsustainable and is causing a lot of wider bads or damage or negative outcomes. But there will be parts of it that would be valuable in retaining. Some infrastructure, some policy elements, etc., may be worth retaining. Horizon 2, the blue there, is a kind of the disruptive innovators who may develop policies and ideas and entrepreneurial things which might actually tend the system towards some new visionary future, which we might call H2+, but they might also actually reinforce elements of H1, the business as usual, and that's a kind of empirical question and one that's determined by a whole bunch of things that are going on. And finally, H3 is kind of what is the vision for the future, this transformative vision that will actually create a much better functioning housing system, which will have a whole range of positive outcomes on society more broadly. So we kind of couched our discussions by thinking about, well, what does H1 look like? What's broken about the housing system? What's the vision that we want to get to H3? And what are the disruptors and the innovations that might put us on that path, as opposed to those which may be more about improving on the existing system, as it were. We can talk more about that, but I just want to briefly just say a couple of words about this table, which is from a paper that Bill Sharp and colleagues wrote in 2016, which basically makes the point that the idea here is that we're in the present now, and we may take a perspective, a Horizon 1, business as usual, a Horizon 2, the disruptive innovation, a Horizon 3, the kind of transformative vision we want to get to. But we might view this in a more negative way or a more positive way. So just to give you an example, under Horizon 1, you might take a negative view. Looking at business as usual now, you might see it as a kind of zero-sum game where it's about competition and dog eat dog sort of thing. But you might also view it more positively as that there are elements of useful infrastructure, etc., and the potential partners that might help you move ahead. Similarly, you might take a negative view about these disruptive innovators you might see as essentially robbing the Horizon 1 status quo of useful investment funds and such like, whereas otherwise you might see it in a much more positive way. And so there will clearly be people who are stakeholders in Horizon 1 who will view Horizon 3 as a bad thing and actually getting in the way of their business. But there'll be other people who'll see it more constructively, etc. So I won't go through the whole thing, but it's really to give you a sense of what that's about. The key thing that Sharp and Lester and others say is that rather than thinking about this as a kind of well theoretically developed academic model, it's about practice. It's about thinking through and discussing what's possible. And Katie Rayworth uses this model very strongly in the kind of climate change kind of environment to think through how the economy can be changed. But we think there's just a massive analogy to the complexity of the housing system in thinking this through. And we found it a very useful framework to actually engage with a whole range of experts and stakeholders from across the housing system and also across the political spectrum as well. And I think I'm going to stop at that point and hand over to Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Absolutely. Certainly we shared that model with our stakeholders, and some of them felt it clarified some of the challenges they've been having in conversations with others about sort of change, sort of each of those perspectives has something to offer. Without Horizon 1, the whole system falls over. So it's not of no value, but if you're thinking about change in the future, you can see why there's a sort of blockage in even comprehension of the situation you're dealing with. So what did we do? So in terms of method, the way this system this project work. Basically, so the Church of England used its sort of convening power to bring together a steering group of members of the House of Lords from each of the main political parties in a crossbench. The Bishop of Housing, we have a Bishop of Housing with the Church of England, and the Bishop of Housing was the sort of sponsor in the House of Lords, with a sort of oversight from the Archbishop of Canterbury. So they brought together a round table of key stakeholders from umbrella organisations and think tanks and across the political parties at the start of this process to share. And we focused at that point on a conversation on, rather than, if you like, anatomizing Horizon 1, at that point we wanted to say, let's start with Horizon 3. And we were helped in this by David Orr, who used to be the chair of the National Housing Federation, to convene this meeting and talk through, well, what do we want? What does good look like? What do we think a good well-functioning housing system looks like, and drawing those views in from different parts of the spectrum, and then a little bit of time at the start to think about, well, what's around, what's happening at the moment that might be interesting. We then conducted semi-structured interviews, pretty much all of those stakeholders and some others, to gather information, a bit more detail on their perspective on Horizon 1, what's wrong at the moment, what might we want to preserve about the current situation, if we're thinking about any particular sort of alternate Horizon 3, which elements of Horizon 1 do we like to keep in that, and what's interesting in terms of innovation from their point of view. And then the report we produced went through a series of iterations and feedback from those stakeholders. The House of Lords representatives on our steering group were fantastically valuable, actually, because I mean the Church of England's aspiration for this is that it is one of the problems of our system is polarization. One of the problems is building cross-party consensus over what we're trying to achieve here, and the idea that we've had sort of pendulum politics for quite a long time. So one of our challenges was to come up with a vision, if you like, for Horizon 3 that we could get everybody from across the spectrum to sign up to. So that was, if you like, that was the exam question, which meant that the feedback from the politicians about what will land or how it will land was really important. And there's something important about that, right down to the level of the sorts of language that the report uses versus maybe other terminology that's floating around in the housing discussion in England at the moment. So if we move on to the next slide, so what we've tried to do is try and articulate some foundations, then go on to think a bit about implications and a sort of vision for well-functioning housing system. So the foundations are, broadly speaking, this is an idea. This basically was informed by the ideas drawn from the policy literature on clumsy policy, and the idea that which is in turn is based on cultural theory, and the idea that people have very different views of the world and different priorities and understandings of how the world works. So we started by saying, okay, let's lay out. In fact, all of this I think will be familiar to housing scholars, but what we are trying to do, I would characterize as saying, here's a reason why we need a strategy. You don't like that reason? What about this reason? Okay, well, you don't like that reason. What about this reason? So we were trying to build up a set of reasons why you might want to think a good, going back to this cross-party, keeping everybody on board idea. So we think, when thinking of the basis, we've got three things. We've got a moral duty, so focusing on the individual or focusing on, if you like, rights. Some of the stakeholders pushed for saying, well, why not talk about a right for housing? A right to adequate housing, because that would fit with, bits of the conversation. Politically, we decided, well, the right for housing plays well with bits of the political spectrum, but it really doesn't play well with other parts. As soon as we use that terminology, we were going to lose some people off the end of this prospective coalition that we're trying to build. So a moral duty to ensure that all households have access to housing, both affordable and acceptable, and that's desirable in itself, regardless of its consequences. So there's that sort of right. So it's rights-based without making the point in those terms, and we could root that duty in a range of different discourses. So again, different people will resonate with different people for different reasons. So secondly, access to affordable and acceptable housing, is more instrumentally useful in the housing context, is a necessary condition for achieving a broader range of well-being objectives. So, you might not think it's a right, but you can appreciate that it delivers a range of benefits around health, well-being, child development, etc. Okay, and if you don't buy into the idea that good housing is important in its own terms, let's think about the broader ramifications for the system. Providing accessible, affordable housing facilitates a broader range of social objectives: labour market participation, labour force, social participation, fiscal savings compared with systems that rely on housing allowances, productivity, which is a big conversation in England at the moment, sustainability, etc. So, you might not be that interested in housing specifically, but look, getting on board with this gives you a broad range of other sort of benefits that you might want to sign up to. So our position is that all of those things are relevant. So a long-term strategy can and should draw on all of those things, but it was really an attempt to sort of resonate with different stakeholders and say it's about respecting dignity, achieving potential, but also sustaining community. And again, those things are maybe not unfamiliar, but bringing them together to try to sort of build the broadest coalition we could. So moving on from that, you know, what we're trying to do is, as Ken said, is steer away from policy recommendations, because as soon as we get into policy mechanisms, apart from the fact there are lots already out there, it starts to diverge and polarize about what's the right way to get there. So what we are trying to do is say, right, okay, well, firstly, where do we want to get to? And and our vision of a well-functioning housing system has got quite a lot of dimensions. In a sense, it goes beyond, say, for example, the right to adequate housing, which in its 7 dimensions. So what we've tried to do in this, I'm not going to go through every one of these bullet points, and you know, at the end of the presentation, there's a link to the report itself. But broadly speaking, what we do is say, well, what do homes look like in a well-functioning housing system? So that's something about choice, it's something about affordability, it's something about quality, etc. So then we'll get a bit more systemic and go, okay, what does the housing market look like in this context? So that's something about supply, it's something about, you know, the nature of the private rented sector. So you know, the nature of mortgage regulations, a bunch of things in there, sort of thinking about the system as a whole. Then on the right-hand side, so how does the housing system, you know, operate as a system? The different parts of the system work together rather than against each other. If you've got siloed policy making, quite often you're pursuing different agendas and different silos which actually don't complement each other all that effectively and can actually rub up against each other. There's some things in there about inflation of rents and prices and stability and reducing volatility. Our system is you know, is very volatile over time, and so can we bring some stability to it in that respect? And then in the bottom right hand corner, some things about how it contributes to some of these broader agendas: economic growth and productivity. The levelling up is the current terminology for sort of spatial rebalancing, I guess. Thinking about regional development or regional inequalities in England, geographical mobility, and then other sorts of systems that interact with healthcare, social care, social security. Some of the things which we're familiar with, but try to bring it all into one place. And then sorry, can you go back to the next slide, the previous slide? Sorry, the bottom right hand corner. I just wanted to pause on, because this point is, I think, quite an interesting one in this context, because it has been written in a relatively anodyne fashion, I think it would be fair to say, as a topic or as a statement which we hope many stakeholders can get on board with. The structures and processes of the housing market do not create social division and do not amplify or intensify social division created elsewhere. This would include processes of discrimination, exclusion, processes of wealth accumulation. There's a few pause on that, and you might say, well, that sounds like a good thing. We can be on board with that as a principle. But actually, that's fairly profound in its implications, if you take that seriously, for if you like, the nature of the housing system that we currently have, and how that differs from what we consider a well-functioning housing system to be. So some of these things are phrased in relatively neutral fashion as broadly positive characteristics, and that's entirely intentional, because the idea is that everyone goes, yeah, actually that seems like a good thing, and then we go, okay, right, well, if we think that's a good thing, what do we need to do to get there? How does our current system compare, and where do we need to move to? So moving on from that, we just think a bit about what the implications are for policy making. From if we can get cross-party support, we can get as many stakeholders as possible, you know, a dominant coalition to support that understanding of what a well-functioning system looks like. What implications does that carry for policy? So firstly, I think this is the one that we would contrast with some of the policy interventions we've had over the recent past. Policy is thoughtful and thought through. So that is, you know, we emphasize effectiveness, and evidence where it is available, but also mindful of uncertainty where it isn't. So this isn't a full-on, you know, relatively simplistic evidence-based policy type argument, because if we're thinking about futures, there's only so far we can get in, and if we're thinking it systemically, there's only so far we can get in thinking about how policy will influence the system. But we need to be thoughtful about that. We need to be mindful of unintended consequences or side effects. We need to think it through carefully and be alive to the possibilities. So thoughtful and thought through. We need to think about it we move away from sort of one size fits all. Our housing markets locally are very different in different parts of the country. So we need to take account of, we need policies that are able to take account of those differences. We need to think about not just backward, so that we've got a forecasting industry, which, if you like, takes the current structure of the system and forecasts forwards. But that's not recognizing the way the system actually evolves over the long term. So we need to be forward looking, scanning the horizon, thinking about the future, thinking about changes in demographics, changes in social norms about the way housing is consumed, a whole bunch of things that are coming. So when we're thinking about planning for housing over that period, we need to have a slightly more sophisticated understanding of where we're going. But it needs to be not just clear where it's going, but agile in the face of complexity. We need to think about how housing, this again, I'm sure resonates with yourselves, how the housing supply industry or land planning and housing institutions to be restructured. One of the big challenges in England is land assembly. The government is not very inclined to use powers of compulsory purchase or land assembly at the moment. But how do we bring forward land in a timely fashion? Infrastructure at scale, master planning, a whole bunch of things which are around in the housing literature, but sort of distilling them down and saying this is going to be necessary to get us through to where we want to be, recognizing those interconnections. And I like this idea in this bullet point. The policy across sectors seeks consistency and coordination wherever possible. And we're not saying it's not saying we can have a holistic approach to everything, but the aspiration should be wherever possible, we need to join these things up intelligently. And then finally, if we're intervening in a complex system, we need better systems of monitoring and evaluations that are real time, better, closer to real time data to understand what's going on. So we have rapid feedback, understand the impact of our interventions, and think about timely course correction. So that analysis and evidence piece is an important part of the jigsaw puzzle if you start to think about this more systemically and as something which is complex in its behavior. So that's, if you like, the implications for policy. We also said, so if we think where we're going, the vision for Horizon 3, where some of the things that we need to do in relation to, if you like, the way of conducting policy. But then we need to move on to think about the way in which the governance architecture is characterized. So those implications. So the role of the central government in the governance architecture. So we wanted to make 2 points. We wanted to say, what does realizing Horizon 3 require of central government? What does it require of the architecture for keeping us on track, basically? So in terms of central government's role, one of the things I think, if somebody pushed me, I don't know about Ken, I'm not sure Ken would speak the same, but I think if say what's the one change we need to make, it would probably be this first one in our system, which is integrate a broader conception of the benefits of adequate housing into policy making and investment decisions. That is, investment appraisal, willingness to put money into social housing is being conducted with a relatively narrow understanding of the benefits. If we actually had a broader understanding of the benefits that can be delivered by that, then it would shift investment priorities. It wouldn't be, if you like, putting money into housing to the detriment of other things. It would be putting money into housing in order to not have to spend so much money on other things. It would actually it would pay back relatively in the medium term. So that thinking about investment more. So that's number one. Coordination, I think systems leadership. So it's not just about the government doing its thing. It's about the government understanding as a role in, if you like, orchestrating the way the system operates to deliver. So that notion of system leadership, and that includes cross-departmental working within government, but also looking beyond government to think about cross-sectoral working. In our discussion with stakeholders, there were quite a lot of private sector stakeholders and not-for-profit stakeholders who were very willing to work with government, very willing to, if you like, adopt a sort of more expansive understanding of what we're trying to achieve. They would quite like the government to get involved as well in having those some clearer aspirations and sort of strategic orientation. Thinking about the voice of citizens within that, both not just current citizens but already future. We had a long debate about whether it was necessary to put a vision on a statutory footing, and I think where we landed with this is, if the vision commands cross-party consensus, if we are on board with that's where we want to get to, then legislating for it would be a way of giving it a solidity, a signal, symbolically, indicating that commitment, and in principle, that some of the barriers to getting things through Parliament would be lower. Now, whether the next parliament, if you're following the UK election, will need that sort of consensus is an interesting question, because it's possible we're going to end up in a situation where the Labour Party has got an enormous majority, so actually it could probably railroad through whether it wants to or not. But actually, we don't think that's what makes policy stick. If we want policy stick for the long term, it's got to be something that a change of government doesn't cause us to completely change direction, because that has been what's been happening over the last little while, and we need to try and get away from that. So a vision that's got everybody on board gives us a sort of beacon to aim for, regardless of which government is in power. And finally, the role, we've had a period of 40 years where the government's not seen its role as taking the lead of not during systems leadership, particularly across 10 years for the whole system. And actually part of this is saying, well, you know, that's got us into this mess. So most fundamentally, we've got to recognise that there's something important that government needs to do here, and it has a role, and it can't just sit back and let the market decide. Is our current governance architecture sufficient for that? I mean, I think our view and the view of our colleagues in the Church and the Nationwide Foundation was no, because if it had been, it would have dealt with some of these challenges in terms of delivering policy of the type we are interested in. But what we wanted was a governance architecture that didn't prescribe particular policies. You know, we need more social housing, we need more of this, we need more of that, but is a mechanism to hold policy proposals to account, if you like, and say, you know, whichever government is in post is going to want to do something. The key thing we need is a system that says, is what you're proposing moving us closer to that vision? You know, if we've agreed this is H3, we've agreed this is where we want to get to, what does that imply? And broadly speaking, we've proposed something like this. The key thing about it is not to leave the housing ministry to make its own way in this. There's a sort of intra-government, cross-departmental component to that, which is not just about civil servants, it's also about a cross-sectoral housing coordination group, getting other stakeholders involved in a conversation with government. But we also suggested this idea of a housing strategy committee, which is a bit like the OBR, a bit like the you know, that sort of a regulatory body that challenges, and the model that we're favouring is we've got something, the Climate Change Committee, which is sort of reports on government's progress towards net zero targets. It also proposes changes to the government's agenda, but we said something of that type, which sits inside the governmental system. So we had a conversation, should we depoliticize like the OBR, put it outside the political system? Should we have something which is inside the political system? Our stakeholders are very clear, they wanted something inside the political system that can hold government to account in a slightly different way. So there's quite a lot of enthusiasm for something like the Climate Change Committee. It says if the government is proposing a set of housing policies, it should be invited to articulate how that gets us closer to achieving the VO. What's the vision? What's the theory of change? You know, what evidence have we got that this is moving us in the right direction? You know, that would, if you like, prevent some of the more egregious policies that we've had over the past, which are clearly taking us in the opposite direction to a well-functioning housing system. And then this suggests we go down through to sort of delivery systems in the bottom half. I won't go through that but it's saying it's not just about local authorities, it's about other types of organisation, rediscovering development corporations, which we haven't had for 40 or 50 years, but also building the linkages between the national, the policy level, which is the top level, and the delivery level. So that delivery body, cross-tenure oversight, so something which links the national conversation about the vision and where we're trying to get to with the local conversations as well. So joining things up more effectively. So moving on for a couple more slides before we finish. So one of the issues about is timescales. Our system, yours may well be similar, suffers from short-termism, sort of pretty chronically, and a focus on quick wins. And we've put this into the policy, which draws from the wicked problems literature, the literature on complexity and policy, and say what we want is not quick wins. What we want is small wins. This comes from Tamir and her colleagues in the Netherlands. And what does that actually mean? So here's a quote straight from the report. Orienting thinking more towards the long term, shouldn't neglect more pressing current issues. This is not an invitation to look for quick wins. Quick wins and picking low hanging fruit, these sorts of terms, typically means targeting those changes that are relatively easy to make. But the fact they're relatively easy to make doesn't mean they necessarily move us in the right direction. So in contrast, if we've got a housing strategy that makes us clear about where we're heading, then what we're looking for is small wins that move us in that direction, rather than quick wins that turn out to be counterproductive. So that is, if you like, so again, it's sort of trying to get us to think, framing the short term within the context of the longer term vision, recognizing we're not going to be able to deliver the longer term overnight, so we need to be doing things in the short term, but being thoughtful about what those short term activities are to move us in the right direction. So moving on from that one, is this so some people, some of our stakeholders, well, this is all feels a bit incremental. I don't think we are of the view that what we're saying is incremental if you think about it. So if we go on to the next slide, for example, Hal will know, everybody who knows, we've had a 300,000 unit per year housing supply target for forever. It took the last 20 years at least. And we haven't made it in any one of those years. So if you simply restate that target and do nothing else, we are nowhere different from where we are at the moment. So therefore, we need to think hard about, well, what would it imply if we say that is the target and we take it seriously? And so here is it. Delivering the target would require actually quite profound change. It requires not just better coordination between planning and infrastructure. We don't have an infrastructure for a system, which causes all sorts of trouble. It needs a reform of the planning system, which is usually the beginning and the end of the conversation. But we also need to build additional capacity in the construction sector, brackets, particularly after Brexit. We need to promote small and medium-sized enterprises, community builders on smaller sites. Our construction industry is concentrated massively into large speculative builders. We need more public sector leadership on land purchase, assembly, and release. We put in it taking in full account of social value, and that in and of itself fundamentally transforms the way the system operates, because it's not about pushing for the highest bidder for any piece of land. Large scale development, master planning sites, new public investment in the planning system, giving it enough capacity to process things. We need to think about more affordable housing and social housing. We need to think about new mechanisms for funding that. We need to expand for money. So there's a whole bunch of things that follow on. If we say don't just restate the target again for the 21st year in a row. Let's take it seriously and go, right, what does that actually imply? And if you take it seriously and you think about it systemically, it implies sort of transformational change across the whole of the housing supply system. Our report doesn't say that. What it does is it invites people to get on board with the objective and then say, right, well, if you're on board with the objective, now let's think hard about what that means by way of change to the system. So just a slide of 3 reflections that I think it would be useful to make at this point by way of finishing. So there's something really interesting about the challenge, the intellectual challenge of framing something transformational that is also seeking to gain cross-party acceptance, right down to the level of, if you like, the individual sentence, the individual concept that you use. Another concept that was key, that some people were keen on, was mission. Matsukazu's idea of sort of mission-oriented policy making, and why don't we frame it in terms of being mission orientated to achieve this? And I'll have to say I resisted that for the reason that the Labour Party has adopted that vocabulary as part of its policy platform. So if we were to frame ours in terms of mission driven, then we would lose some of the other parties. They're saying, well, actually this is too closely aligned to the Labour Party. So right down to the level of that sort of language to say, how can we say, well, actually we're sympathetic to that objective, but we want to keep everybody on board. So something really interesting about how we try and do that. So there's also an issue about, as we know, everybody knows doing policy work, the tension between sort of evidence and intellectual credibility and sort of stakeholder management and what some of the stakeholders wanted to see included, and which we know is not particularly evidence-based or is deeply problematic in 1 or 2 cases. And how do we negotiate some of those sorts of discussions to say we're going to arrive at something which, and I think where we ended up with the main report, when you look at it, is we had support from some sort of right-wing think tanks and also other people say, yeah, we're quite on board with what you're saying here. So as a starting point, as well as sort of housing professional organisations and policymakers on different bits of the spectrum. So we got something which people said, yeah, actually, we quite like what this is saying. But the thing we've still got to do, really, going back to the futures piece, is and Ken's point about sustainability is, there's some work to be done on sort of transformational pathways. How the report, as it stands, doesn't say much about how do we get from here to there. Very much the view was it's for policymakers to articulate an agenda. It's for policymakers to articulate how that agenda does that. It's not for us to do that. But I think in our work, if you like, once the main report with the churches has been published, I think we want to say a bit more about transformational pathways. How do we get from here to there? And I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thanks very much to you both. Fantastic. So just way too much to think about there. You've got some applause, some virtual applause. And we do have a few questions, so I'll just quickly take you through some of those. Let's start with David Lilly, another former PhD student in City Futures. David says, can you say more about how you hope to convince people in other sectors to take an integrated systems approach? here in New South Wales, it feels like you can convince people within the housing sector to get on board with a vision, but every sector has their own thinking and their own agenda. And how do you break through those boundaries?
Well, that's an interesting one. So I think there's several layers to that, I think.
Yeah.
So who is it in the other sectors that need convincing, and how one goes about it? So the only other sector that I've had direct conversations with about this is the sort of social security welfare reform sector. So I've talked to them about it to directly at some length. And if at the level of civil servants, they absolutely get the point. And so at that level, you can say, well, actually, this will help us potentially, working in this sort of way, thinking more systemically about this. I mean, the key thing is say, well, does this help us achieve our objectives within our within our policy domain? And I think that certainly I found them open to that. But it's that thing about how does it contribute to achieving their objectives, which is different. And I think the policy, civil servants, that policy making layer, that's not too. But at the layer of the politicians, you get into sort of empire building, or actually sort of different domains, if you like, of and so that seems to me to be a bit more of a challenging one. But again, I think it's about how we tell the story about how this. So, for example, productivity is a good example for that. I think there is work going on at the moment in the sort of economic sphere, which is also in which housing sits in the list of things that are impeding productivity. Yeah, but it's not. It's on the list, but it's not high up the list. I think for some of that. So I think part of it, it's about connecting those conversations in a way that moves housing up the list and tells that story a bit more effectively. And I think there is convergence there. I mean, I think in the UK, the key stakeholder is the Treasury to convince. Actually,
yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
it's not the spending departments. The spending departments can be convinced, but it's the Treasury who has to be convinced. They need to go back to this thing about how do they evaluate investments and funding allocations.
Yeah, exactly.
There is so much that you're saying, Alex, that we could just substitute Australia for UK in this. It's uncanny how many parallels there are. Okay, we could probably look very hard and find a few differences, but some of the problems that you're identifying, some of the blockages, some of the sort of fragmentation, it's all extremely familiar. And I think that the thinking that you've done to create this analysis really or method is going to be something that we'll find very useful to look at. So maybe Jeff, if you're Jeff Turnbull, would you mind switching on your microphone, and would you like to just tell us your question, because I'm not sure I quite get the gist of it, but it's referring to the role of people inside the tent, which I think is you two and others that you're talking to, and policymakers, and what Jeff calls outside the tent. Are you still on, Jeff? Do you want to just explain that?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, you talked about in your presentation about setting up the mechanism within government, within a position to be able to influence what was happening. And I just wonder what role there is for those people that are outside the tent that helps to drive this process, because quite often it's actually the voices outside that make the people that are on the inside working within government look quite reasonable and gives them more room to manoeuvre. I'm just sort of wondering how you see what you're doing fitting with a whole pile of those voices outside the tent, I guess.
If I can maybe start. And thanks for that question. A number of things strike me. One thing that we're talking a lot about in Scotland, and it reflects what's happening in other parts of Europe, is things like citizens panels and citizens juries as a way of providing a different form of citizen-based authority and credibility in arguments about things like, so I mean, famously, a lot of Irish social policy has been governed by citizens' juries and assemblies over a period of time. And recently it kind of didn't work out with a referendum, but the broader point's definitely valid. And we are certainly interested in Scotland, and we've just done a citizens panel on local government finance reform and tax reform, and that's been a really powerful kind of exercise. So it seems to me that one of the things we can do is try to find alternative ways of allowing an informed debate of citizens, which is unfiltered by political actors, as it were. Not to say that it's an easy objective thing to provide the evidence to facilitate the debate. That's got to be very professionally done. That's one kind of mechanism, I think, that would be quite important. But the other one that I was really struck by, and was kind of quite a transformative moment for me, was recognizing that people who are politically active in think tanks and in third sector charities like Crisis in Britain could actually respond in the same way to a proposition. So the one that we, and Alex and I both use this in teaching, there's a quite famous blog paper by Sam Bowman about the housing crisis called The Housing Theory of Everything from 2021, which pulls together a lot of things that we've been seeing in our different research fields about the perils of the way the housing system is unfolding, but says it in a way that captures the imagination. Looks at the less visible impacts on the rest of society, on the health, on the economy, on obesity and climate change, as well as on the narrow housing market. And you would get the chief executive of Crisis saying, "That's how I see the world," but you'd also get the head of the Centre for Policy Studies, the sort of Tory inside think tank, saying, "Yeah, that's how I see the world," and that's quite amazing, really. There are ways to get these things across to that level before, and I say there are other mechanisms perhaps that can help push that as well.
Thanks, Ken. Ondine, would you like to voice your question? If you're still on.
Hi, Hal. It's Hugh here.
Oh, Hugh.
I'm just interested in Ken and Alex's thoughts about any kind of suggestion that change will bring the value of housing down. That I mean, that's sort of one of the key characteristics of the bad place that we've got ourselves to. Yeah, I'm interested. I know in Australia, for example, it's very likely, the opposition would whip up a very effective scare campaign if it looked like changes were going to make housing more affordable for ordinary people. It's a conflict of collective conflict of interest, a community conflict of interest that we have around this issue.
So I'll have a go at that one. So I absolutely, we're very acutely aware of that. I think one of the things one of the reasons why we're arguing for a sort of systemic view of this is that's one of the things that looms quite large in our thinking, because I mean I think one of the things that I don't think is well enough understood in this is sort of how we've arrived at where we are, and therefore where we might go to unravel it. And I think that one of the things that the current report doesn't say quite so clearly, or it alludes to, but the one that will come out says more clearly, is actually the solution to this. I think the solution to this problem, if there is one, lies in the reform elsewhere at the same time. So I think you're absolutely right. If you say, well, what we want to do is reduce your house prices by 50% or something, people will resist. So the question is, why are we in this? Why? So one of those things will be, for example, the rise of buy-to-let. And why do we see the rise of buy-to-let in England? Well, it was partly to do with changes to the private pension system. So people say, well, private pensions no longer pay, so therefore we're going to put our money in housing instead as a sort of as a way of generating pension income. So the answer to that particular issue for that particular part of the population then is, well, we need to do something about other classes of investment. So we're not saying people can't save, people can't accumulate for retirement. I think the point is, don't do it through housing, do it through something else. So you've got to join those two conversations up. Another one in our case would be things like social care, long-term for older age. You go, well, why am I holding on to my housing equity? Well, partly it's because I have no confidence that I'm going to be able to afford care in older age, and the public system no longer provides adequate care in older age. So I'm going to need to hold on to my housing equity if I can, so that I've got those resources to sort of self-insure. Yeah. Now, so the answer, so if you said, well, we're just going to make sure your house price goes down by 50%, then now we've got no public provision, we've got inadequate public provision, and now you don't have the resources to pay for it privately either. So you're doubly in trouble. The thing to do is deal with the social care component of that, you know, and give people confidence. So the people who that's their motivation for resisting change to the housing market is being dealt with through that route. So there's not one answer to that, but I think it's thinking about why we are where we are, what's motivating different people in that sort of in being protective about their housing situation or housing. And it's not only instrumental. Obviously, for some people, it's the housing. But unless we start dealing with the carrots, if you like, as well as the stick, then you're gonna then you will have intractable problems about getting change, because people won't want to see change. But then you've got to build more confidence in government offering alternative solutions. To say, if we say we'll fix the social care system, it's demonstrably got to be fixed before people will let go of, if you like, the self-insurance motive. So there's a lot of interconnection there, which is why it's going to take quite a long time to get to a different place.
Thanks very much, Alex. We've probably got time for one more question. Rachel, I wonder if you could switch on your mic and summarise your question, which is quite long, but you can probably say it quickly.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you for this, presentation. Very inspirational, if not encouraging. I do work in the housing sector myself. So, I'm all, for systemic thinking, but how do you convince more than the politicians or the stakeholders is society itself? Because I believe home ownership is so ingrained in our everyday thinking that moving away from it as some form of economic security is quite tough. So sometimes you have to deal with society itself rather than, with the politicians, although obviously there are agendas. And so once you do that, how possible is it, realistically speaking, to actually have a value, right, side by side of that of economy and politics? So how can we scale up, right, the value of housing to that of politics, culture, and religion, perhaps? So that's me. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel.
Well, I'll start with that. I mean, that's a great question. I think we are hearing during the election campaign just now that many people are recognising major housing problems of lack of access, of unaffordability, and the impacts it's having in people's lives, and they clearly don't feel that any of the political parties are responding to that effectively. Meanwhile, the political parties are obsessing, really rather depressingly, on the wedge of higher taxes related to housing. Capital gains tax, inheritance tax, council tax have all been discussed in the last week as scare tactics, really. So, and that really inhibits positive debate. I mean, I'd go back to what I say earlier. I think we need to find new ways to engage, to let people think through the economic, the healthcare, the social care, as Alex has said, those sorts of issues, and why housing is a fundamental constraint as things stand in making progress in these other areas. And that's what Sam Bowman's housing theory of everything really states in a really clear way, which, as I say, cuts through in some ways. So I can't pretend we have the answer. We are starting this process, I guess. But maybe Alex has got some other thoughts.
No, I absolutely agree with that. But I don't think so. So just one element of what you're saying there is I don't. Nothing in what we're saying is saying there shouldn't be home ownership and people shouldn't own their own homes. I don't think we're saying that. I think what we are saying is in the English context at the moment is home ownership or owning residential property has become the primary mechanism for accumulation, which for some households has always been the case, but a range of other classes of investment have sort of fallen by the wayside, and now it is seen as like the primary, as almost the only way you're going to make a return. And it's that, and at the same time, home ownership has gone down as a proportion of the population quite dramatically over this sort of the last 20 years, So it's not home ownership per se that's the problem, I don't think, personally. I mean, it's more of a problem in terms of affordability is the growth of private renting in the UK as at the at the expense of both social renting and home owner occupation. Actually, the real problem we got at the minute is exorbitant for parts of the country, is absolutely exorbitant rents, which are having all sorts of impacts on household formation and a whole bunch of other issues, cost of living crisis more generally, etc., precarity, etc. So I don't think we're not making a judgment on sort of 10-year balance and saying, well, there should be less home ownership. You shouldn't accumulate. You shouldn't seek to own your own home. I think what we're saying is, if you want to, I think what we think the government should be saying is, it's great if people wish to, accumulate assets, but just for goodness sake, don't do it through housing. Do it through other, like a German regional bank or something. Whatever you want to do, other investment opportunities. That means that the housing market can do what it should be doing, which is provide accommodation for households and not being used for these other sorts of, purposes as well.
You've got some virtual applause for that, Alex, and you would get it from me, except I'm trying to pay attention to the time, which has gone past 5 here and past 8 where you are. So I think we probably should draw it to a close. But just to mention to those who are still on the call, we have recorded the session, and we'll put the recording up on our website. We'll probably put a LinkedIn post to notify people that it's going up, because there's so much, and there's so much depth in what you've talked about, that I think we all will need to watch it twice at least. So thanks very much, Ken, Alex, and thanks to everyone was on the call as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good to
Thanks
see
so
you,
much.
Hal. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Great job.
Thanks very much. Excellent.
Perfect.
It's going to rain all the weekend.